So I'll just introduce myself. So I'm reader in Greek literature at Warwick. I've been at Warwick since 2008. I work on archaic and classical Greek literature, mostly lyric poetry, hence the kind of lyrically inflected version of my video. But I teach everything in Greek literature from Homer onwards, pretty much. So the kinds of questions I can help you with will be both specific and general. I'm going to start with the general question from Jodie Reynolds, who asks, she's never taught the Iliad before. Can I recommend one book to help me? What would that be? Besides more generally, in terms of reading, well, I will answer the question in two ways. I will answer if you want a specific way into reading what's going on in the Iliad, kind of specifically, then I think there are kind of some quite good introductory basic books by pretty well-known Homeric scholars, and quite recent, some kind of very old school, old-fashioned, fairly long in the tooth ones by well-established people like Jasper Griffin, but also more recent things like Barbara Graziosi has an Oxford World's Classic, an Oxford very short introduction to Homer. She is, she was at Durham, she's now at Princeton. She's, one of the really big hitters in the world on things Homeric in a modern kind of contemporary way. So that would be probably my first suggestion. One of the books that we generally put on reading lists for students has generally been something like Mark Edwards' Homer, Poet of the Iliad, which gives you a thematic breakdown of what's going on in individual books and raises general thematic and interpretative issues. In terms of kind of the other aspect, if I could recommend one book to help me, what would that be beside the Iliad itself? Well, I would really strongly suggest you read the Iliad, lots and lots, and think about the different translations and the different ways of translating it. And I would definitely recommend a verse translations. And I would recommend you starting with two translations. One would be the Lattimore Chicago translation, and another one would be Robert Fagel's in the Oxford, I think it's the Oxford World's Classics. It might now be Penguin, I can't remember. Yes, as I said, I don't have either of those to hand. I have the Greek text next to me, but I don't have, my books are a bit haywire, as I mentioned. So what's interesting about both of those is to compare and contrast how you feel about how they articulate what the Iliad actually feels like, right, as a poem. And one of the things I'm really interested in, and I hopefully came across in my talk, was the sense of Homer as a body, the sense of the Homeric poems as a body of work, as a form, as a structure with very distinctive features, which early poets, singers, the early culture of Greece are responding to and figuring out in their own ways. So for me, what makes Lattimore and Fagles together work really well, although neither of them on their own is perfect, is a kind of double sense you get. So when you read Lattimore, it's very traditional, very it emphasizes the formulae. It's very accurate in terms of being a descriptive account of what the Greek says where. it feels kind of authentic in the sense of being, you know, it feels like a traditional poem structured in, you know, the way the epic is structured. What's also really good about Lattimore's translation is it has line numbers every 5 lines that match directly the line numbers in the Greek text. So you can be pretty sure when you're reading any bibliography or scholarship or any of the references that people make in any of the books to line numbers, that the line numbers you are reading in your translation will match. So you won't feel lost. That's one of the really big battles that we often find with students, is trying to figure out, you know, to get a handhold. That's obviously a problem with prose translations, which was one of the main reasons why I don't recommend prose translations, beyond the fact that they're just kind of not responding to the form, the feel of the poem as it structures itself, because it's using prose rather than verse. What I would say about Fagles' translations. So Fagles' translations with line numbers are a bit more complicated. They have the series of line numbers of the Greek text listed at the top of the page, but they have their own line number. It has its own translations line numbers down the side. So again, you have to do a bit of guesswork when you're reading across from the original texts, original text of the Iliad into or references to it into a translation. What's really good about the Fagles translation very frequently is that he seems able, partly because of the way he's able to expatiate in his own kind of poetic way, he is able to capture the feel of speeches especially. One of the things that really matters about the Homeric approach to epic, as it were, is the really, really huge significance of direct speech. That the heroes actually speak. It's not just, you know, narrative with figuration and imagery and similes all the time, but the interrelation between the ways characters speak and articulate their thoughts and the way the main narrative operates. And what's often really, really, really important about the Iliad is the tension between those two things. The way in which a kind of a speaker in the heroic world talks about themselves and their attitudes and their complaints, or, you know, formulates their value structures, their ideas about, you know, their relations with other people, and where things go wrong. So the Iliad is generally a poem about where things go wrong for characters, right? Things don't turn out well for pretty much anybody, apart from gods, but then that's why they're gods, right? What happens in the Iliad is that, you know, there's this massive differentiation between the sense that the world is going wrong from the human's mortal's perspective in the poem, and the sense from the narrative that this is a grand, amazing, exemplary, heroic, distant, you know, world that we can put on a pedestal, and value for that. And one of the amazing things about the Iliad, which is why it is so rich and why I think many of the responses to Homer in the archaic period is so rich, is because of that duality. That sense in which, you know, this is a world of destruction, but it's also a world that has created this amazingly beautiful thing, which is this incredible poem, with a character at the center of it, Achilles, who is so extraordinary, because he can't be written off as simply destructive or simply, you know, heroic or, you know, beautiful, or, you know, because Achilles is the exemplary mortal figure, that who carries with him all of the complexities that the poem seems to be enacting for us as we interpret it in all its richness. So that's why, for instance, in my talk, one of the passages I homed in on was the Achilles' lyre playing in lines 185 to 90 of book 9. Where we feel in the description of the lyre playing the kind of that tension between beauty and pleasure. Beauty, the tension between beauty and pleasure on the one hand and destruction on the other. Because this lyre carries with it, you know, the sense of its being kind of war booty, and bearing with it all the hallmarks of a moment of a moment of massive destruction, the flattening of a city. But somehow something has been created out of that, which is Achilles' song. It's about glorious deeds, which is what the Iliad instantiates, right? The glorious deeds of men, but in ways that, as I say, because of the tension that the poem enacts, is really, really much richer than a simple view articulated by an individual character in an individual moment in the poem, or an individual perspective offered by the narrator at one particular point. So I was just talking about why attending to and drawing attention to the ways in which your students can attend to the formal characteristics of the poem will pay massive dividends. Because understanding that is the way into understanding why it is so culturally important for a broader understanding of early Greece, and the ways in which, in fact, classical Greece came to understand itself and its values, quite often through that kind of response, that sense of response to the Iliad's own complexities, as emblematized by Achilles, of course. I will also just say a little bit about which books of the Iliad you might want to focus on. I would definitely recommend books 1, book 6, and book 9, and book 18, 22, and 24. Book 1, because that thematizes all of the main issues of the poem. It's programmatic. In a sense, it sets up the program of the kinds of things that the epic is going to get interested in. Book 6, because that's where you see one really important place where you get to see Troy from the inside, but also because you get really to grips with the character of Helen and why the character of Helen really matters. I would also add Iliad book 3 to that. I think book 9 is arguably the most important book in the whole poem, because it offers up Achilles as the most articulate character in the entire poem, and offers up Achilles as the articulator of his values and the poem's kind of complexity of values, because of course Achilles rejects the terms in which Agamemnon has tried to appeal to him, and rejects the ways in which the rest of the Greeks have tried to appeal to him to relent his wrath, which is causing grief to both sides. Why that is important is because you don't want to read book 9 of the Iliad and say, oh, well, Achilles is the bad guy, because Achilles is the most important character in the whole poem. And Achilles is the character who emblematizes, as I said, the Iliad's great complexity, its great interest, its richness, because he knows more about being immortal than anyone else, partly because his mother's a goddess and has told him he's going to die in an extraordinary way. And he's got these two fates, and he's going to have to make a choice. That's why Achilles is so important. book 18, because I could send book 16 because that's where Patroclus fights and dies. But from my perspective, book 18 is crucial because of the shield of Achilles, which is the first major, most important ekphrasis in Greek literature, which again gets you to think about form, gets you to think about what poem is and how it communicates, and thinks about artistry and creativity as a complex, multifarious resource for attitudes to worlds. Famously, the shield of Achilles opens up a vast panorama of views of different worlds happening that we are able to see because of the artistry of Hephaestus. 22, book 22 is crucial because of that. That's the climactic space where Achilles and Hector finally fight, and Hector dies. Some of the most richly descriptive passages in the whole poem, but also, you know, really crucial for a general attitude to Homeric heroism via Hector. And book 24 is also really, really important because you get to the end of the poem and think you know what the poem's attitudes to, you know, Achilles and the world of the hero actually is. And then book 24 shakes it all up again because of the meeting between Achilles and Priam, and the ways that the kind of pitiful, kind of organic way in which the poem brings itself to a close in the harmoniousness between two very isolated figures does something that the poem just really hasn't achieved up to that point. But in some of the scholarship on the bibliography on Iliad 24, book 24, it also on those terms looks forward to the Odyssey. Can we talk about the Odyssey as well? Of course we can talk about the Odyssey as well. What would you like to... I was prepared to talk about the Odyssey, of course. Would you... What sort of things would you like me to say about the Odyssey? I will I will guess, but so sorry, go ahead.
Hi, I'm not teaching right now, so I'm just thinking about ways to approach the Iliad Odyssey when I go back into teaching, post motherhood, and I'm wondering how attitudes of academic attitudes have changed. But when I was at university, it was very much the two things that I remember in the Iliad. The first word being menin. That was, that's something that really still sticks with me. And then with the Odyssey, I've just been thinking a lot recently about this image of Odysseus in book 5, crying his eyes out, and those were kind of the things that my teachers were focusing on. And I suppose, for me, it's always about how can you make it relevant to the student. So, what do we need to do to are those should we still be focusing on those kind of things, or how does it move on?
Yeah, that's right. So I think anger actually is wrath, anger, menace with the Iliad is really still very much in play. Very, very important, because that's a way of kind of actually, the poem reaching out and saying, what is this about? What are the complexities involved here? How do we understand the actions and behavior of the poem's main character as an emblem for the poem, which feeds into what I was saying about why book 1 and book 9 are so important, but also why book 24 is so important. Because the modulations of your view of someone's morality as an exemplar, as a paradigm for other people to buy into, is really, really complex, right?
Yeah.
So wrath, how does anybody deal with the Iliad's proem? Any of the characters deal with the Iliad's proem is, in a sense, what the Iliad is all about. What I would say about the Odyssey, when you're talking about, you know, you really, really remember the fact that Odysseus cries. Right, the same. I'm reading the chat at the same time as speaking. The same kind of issues as somebody writes in the chat are still very much in play, but get focused much more squarely through thinking about culture from the inside, because the Odyssey is so much more obsessed than the Iliad is, much more explicitly obsessed, at least, than the Iliad is about song and singing and storytelling as the vehicle for the articulation of these complexities. So alongside, you know, thinking about Odysseus in the narrative crying, you can in book 5, you can see Odysseus crying in book 8 when he's responding to storytelling, the songs of Demodocus, as the way into Odysseus revealing his identity and then going on to sing, but sing and tell stories in ways that kind of create more problems for a straightforward definition of Odysseus as a good guy, right? Because Odysseus isn't a good guy. You know, he fails. He you know he loses all his men. He doesn't get any his men home. He's not a great leader in that sense, right? And he's also when he gets back to and reveals himself to the suitors towards the end, right? Performing all the same tropes that he found in his foes, right? He's donning all those martial, violent characteristics that characterize not just the heroes in the Iliad, that in a sense the Odyssey is struggling to leave behind, but also all those violent foes, all those violent monster figures, kind of in the mythical domain of the wanderings, especially Polyphemus. So the way in which the Odyssey plays around with characters is also driven through figuration. So we can't again with the Odyssey, no less than the Iliad, kind of separate out thinking about violence as an idea from the way the poem articulates what that is, which is in the Homeric poems through imagery, through similes. So it's really important. It's really important in the Odyssey that one of the climactic similes they used to characterize Odysseus killing the suitors is a lion simile, which is kind of both feels familiar from one's understanding of the Iliad, but also is a simile that Polyphemus gets when he's killing and murdering and eating Odysseus's men in the cave. So the tension between the justification for the killing of the suitors as ordained and sanctified by the gods, and how that actually manifests itself on the mortal level in the Odyssey and how we understand those mortal characters is really complicated, but complicated in the Odyssey in a way that pushes the aspect of song, the aspect of storytelling as itself a complex thing to get absorbed in. So isn't it fascinating that we still class Odysseus as a hero despite him not being the good guy? Yes, of course. And that's another way into thinking about the cultural significance of Homeric heroism. Because if we didn't have that, there'd be no Greek tragedy, right? We didn't have that complexity. There'd be no figures like, Sophocles as Ajax, or Sophocles as Antigone, or Sophocles as Creon. I'm talking about Sophocles, right? But we could equally say we wouldn't want to class Clytemnestra as a hero necessarily, but as a kind of protagonist of Greek tragedy. That there's a sense in which the kinds of things that tragedy does to our heads, which is obviously what Aristotle was bothered about in the Poetics, are fundamentally already set up and staged in the Homeric poems. But as I would repeat, going back to my presentation, that even in the early archaic period, poetry is already responding to, because poetry already understands that it's the form in which those ideas are enacted which creates the issues for us. Right? Everything is mediated through how a poem articulates itself, and how we feel about characters is is an attunement to how we feel about the poems as bodies of work, as cultural products, as things we value. So in terms of engaging, going back to the question I was asked about, engaging students with the Odyssey, asking them questions about song, asking them questions about how do they feel about singing, how do they feel about singing songs themselves, how do they feel about listening to songs, how do songs make them feel sad, how do songs make them feel happy, who are their kind of who are their favorites, who are the figures in songs that they most kind of latch on to. Those kinds of questions for me might be good ways of getting students to attend to the way poems work as songs, but things that we now read. Am I right in thinking that ancient heroes are not necessarily good guys? Absolutely, right? Just that they stand out for some special quality they possess. I don't think the quality is the thing. Again, I would talk not in the abstract about the qualities they possess, but the ways in which poems enact the complexities of their identities. You can't say in Achilles' case that he has a moral flaw or anything like that, or an interesting aspect to his character. You can talk in Achilles' case that he has an interest in honor, or time, or values, just as anybody else in the Iliad. But he articulates his response to what that means for him in a much more elaborate and complex way than anybody else. That's why Achilles matters. Homeric heroes are heroes by definition, in a sense, because they get sung about in song, which is Helen's point in Iliad 6, when she says, the reason why we're suffering is only because people in the future will sing about us. And that's our lot. That's our mortal lot. But so I think there are degrees, right? There are degrees of one's attunement to the way in which Homeric heroes matter. Of course, Odysseus and Achilles and Hector and Agamemnon are going to matter more than individuals on the battlefield dying, but individuals on the battlefield dying might matter in different ways because of the way a Homeric narrator manages to articulate the sense of what they're in, of what their death means, which is imagery, similes, all the rest of that. I think I'm going to have to draw to a close now because my time is coming to an end. Paul, can I answer a couple more questions?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
So what about Odysseus and his metis? Yes, metis, his cunning intelligence. His cunning intelligence, which is not to be separated from his violence. And that's it as the heart of the issue in Odyssey 9. One obvious way of thinking about that would be to think about the craft simile that the Odyssey uses to describe and illustrate the violence of Odysseus's blinding of Polyphemus. Yeah, metis, cunning intelligence, craftiness as a positive aspect, but not to be divorced from the violent aspects of what that entails. Would I say that Achilles is more complex than Odysseus or vice versa, or each just different forms of complexity? I would say each just different forms of complexity, because of the ways in which the two different poems articulate their senses of those characters, right? In their relationships between others in that world, but also in the ways in which the poem figures that world, right? Great. I think that is probably me finished. Thanks very much for all the questions. That was, I think that worked really well. Enjoy the rest of your day, and please do ask lots of questions.
Right.